Hello, everyone. Hi. And a special hello to our friends and colleagues who are joining us from the live stream. Hello down there. I hope you're enjoying yourselves too. Strategy. I want to talk today in my presentation about strategy. What counts as strategy? Everybody in this room has played and will play a certain kind of role when it comes to strategy, and I'd like to propose in my presentation that we need to re-engage with our work in this space. We need to rethink what it means to think, say, and do strategy, particularly as it relates to educational technology, but also more broadly. And you only need to look at the history of strategy documents across our sector to feel a certain degree, I think, of discomfort. Some of the strategic directions and language that we use is very dense. It's very hard to understand. We're very good, quite rightly so, about painting aspirational and very bold pictures about where we're going. But in my experience, we also have a responsibility to make sure that these strategies are simple and that they're useful and that they're the sorts of things that speaks to the values and approaches of all disciplines, of all different students. So in my presentation today, I'd like to touch on what that means in strategy, and to do so, I'm going to talk through where I work and what we do and how we're organised and what we've done. I'd also like to give an overview of the challenges that I see facing our sector and my institution and how my particular university is responding to those challenges. In addition, I'd like to talk with you about the things that I think are useful in my sort of day-to-day work as a practitioner in this space. And if we have time, I'd like to talk a little bit about the things that I'm excited about in the very near future. But before we get into all that, let me introduce myself. I'm a fan. I'm a fan of teaching and learning. I'm a fan of beautiful educational design. I'm a fan of universities and the mission that we have collectively to improve society and to participate with our communities. But if you look at the automatic summary that LinkedIn gave me, I'm the most boring person in this room. Come on, LinkedIn, you've got to do better than that, surely. It's just a list of jobs. So I think it's on me to convince you that I'm actually much more interesting than that list over there. And to do that, I'd like to point you toward the top skills I have. And these are the things that make me so incredibly successful in my job. I'm disorganised. I'm a little bit immature. I'm impulsive. I talk too much. And I get easily distracted by daydreams. Now, these are important in my line of work. Because I'm disorganised, there's a lot of chaos around me, which is essential, because it's in chaos that the good ideas happen, that the connections and the surprising new work becomes apparent and becomes achievable. I'm immature and impulsive, which means I find it very easy to look at the work we do in the terms of a new student, a first-year student, or somebody who's never come across the ways of thinking and doing that I'm trying to proselytise about. So this is a deliberate way to talk, I think, at the start of my presentation about a digital learning strategy roadmap, because, folks, as many of our other presenters in this conference have said, it's actually kind of not about the technology. This is about the people we work with, the people we work for, and the people that we engage with every single day. And it's no surprise to anyone in this room to hear people are complicated. People are very mysterious. People are very unpredictable. People change their minds often. And if we are not mindful that we're in the people business, not the technology business, then any kind of strategic work that we do is bound to fail. And this is why I think it's so very important that we reconceive what we think of as a teaching and learning strategy, as a digital learning roadmap and set of strategies. So just to illustrate that change, this is my second Blackboard conference. So the first one was in 2002. And as you can see by this photo, I've changed. I've changed enormously. And I'm glad I'm so much better looking now, so much more skilled. All right. So alongside those changes to an individual and to the people we work with, any kind of strategy has to be deeply situated in the context and place within which we work. And I work for the University of Queensland, and I'm quite happy to say I love it. It is I'm enormously privileged to work at this university. The collection of people, the passions, the talent, the work that we do, like all of you at your universities, I think it has a quirkiness to it that I very much enjoy engaging with. One of the things about the University of Queensland is that it quite rightly sees itself as a global university that's situated in Brisbane. And one of the many challenges and opportunities that I have in my work there is that we have a beautiful campus. It's actually quite large, it's stunning. So we don't want to have a digital learning ecology and set of practices that keeps students away. No, not at all. We want our students to come to our campus and be completely transformed by the experiences that they have on that campus. So that's a particular idiosyncrasy to the work that we're doing. We don't want students to come for the sake of it, but when they're at our campus, our stunning campus, and in the formal and informal experiences that they have, we want them to be truly powerful. By the numbers, I mean, we love these sorts of things. It's a comprehensive university, like what Michael referred to before. What does a comprehensive university mean? Well, we teach a number of different things. So in our strategic work, we need to make sure that we facilitate some very distinct pedagogical histories and discipline practices and discipline aspirations. But what's more, we need a virtual learning ecology that helps leverage interdisciplinarity. You know, we want soil scientists to be talking to archaeologists, to be talking to musicologists. So we can't afford to have a siloed approach to our virtual learning environments, our physical environments as well. We're a research-intensive university, very proud of our research profile, and with that comes the opportunity to emphasise the teaching research nexus, research training, research-informed teaching. And again, that has a knock-on effect to the choices that we make around our virtual learning environment. And as I said, it's a global university. We have staff and students from across the world. So it's not enough to be inclusive. We need to leverage this talent. Our students are staff, our citizens of a global community with fascinating and interesting and useful perspectives from their cultural background. So our virtual learning environment, again, has to be very sensitive of cultural differences, cultural strengths, the way that we can bring together all of these competencies to create, again, very powerful and transformative educational experiences. And I think we have to be very, very critical of some of the cues and messages that we provide culturally in the way we construct these environments. So this is my context, and it's the context in which I'm trying to be effective and thrive. So every university is slightly different. That's what I love about universities. And they organise themselves in slightly different ways. Some universities, they lead the digital learning charge from the library. Some from the information technology area. Some from the School of Education, some from the School of Computer Science and so forth. And this is the design that we've come up with at the University of Queensland. So we have a collection of teams in a very large building on our St Lucia campus. So for example, Simon Collier leads our e-learning support and systems team, and they do a lot of the sort of frontline work. They do a lot of the training, the guides, the resources, a lot of the technology adoption, and they contribute enormously to our strategic thinking about that mix of virtual learning environments. Anisha Bakaria and Hassan Khosravi head up our learning analytics and technologies team. And like some of the presentations yesterday, they're very passionate about creating environments that help our academic teaching teams provide actionable insights. So what are they doing in the course of teaching to not just remediate students that are at risk, but to help those excellent students become exceptional students? And that's the mission of the learning analytics team that we have at UQ. And in addition to that, we are creating a whole bunch of different discipline-specific technologies and tools. We have a very strong, high-performing higher education team, and these are our academics in higher education. And they are heavily engaged with a lot of the research that is focusing on new digital pedagogies, new practices, and new ways of teaching and learning in our current context. The course development group are focused on these very specific projects, MOOCs, MicroMasters, that large-scale digital uplift type program led by Janet Frizerin and John Zornig, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more depth soon. So my point here is that these people all work in the same building, and it's very striking to me the amount of work and thinking that happens in the hallway, in the staircase. So organisational design, in order for a digital learning strategy to be successful, needs to build in the informal, the community, the social. In fact, in some ways, I think it's the day-to-day conversations, the discoveries from talking to a new colleague that you haven't perhaps spoken to before, that really fuel the innovation that we're engaged in. So a digital learning strategy, I think, needs to start with good organisational design. And of course, this is not the only powerhouse of pedagogical innovation in the university, far from it. Our connections with the library, with ITS, with our many amazing colleagues in the faculties of schools are essential to this work, the work in student affairs as well. So we've done quite a bit in the last couple of years. This is an old graphic, it's just from 2017, but a few things really occur to me. So we've had over 3 million students have an experience of our MOOCs in the last 4 or 5 years. What does that mean? It means that we've had over 3 million students have an experience of what it's like to be a University of Queensland student. And so we've learnt a hell of a lot from this work, and the lessons that we've learned from that, we're introducing into our curriculum. We have an enormous amount of professional learning events and programs specific for schools and faculties. We have a lot of fellows from other universities, very active in the research space. We're actively contributing to the higher education academy community, and like every university, we're very much in support of the awards, the fellowships and the grants and so forth. Now, a digital learning roadmap or strategy is, in my mind, it's an enabling strategy. It's like being at Hollywood, but not being an actor. It has to support all of the other work that's going on. And so the bigger picture is captured here in our University of Queensland student strategy. You know, where we want to create transformation. It's like that cliche, if you want to predict the future, you have to invent it. Well, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to produce game-changing graduates. We're trying to navigate that very tricky balance between students who work, who need flexibility, and the need to help scaffold and direct and create self-regulation amongst these students. It's a very difficult design challenge. And there are a number of initiatives in which these objectives are being instantiated. Learning analytics. We're looking at what we're calling alternative credentials. I'm not sure for how long we'll be calling it alternative credentials. We're trying to improve the digital practices that are supported by technologies from e-assessment and e-portfolio. We're doing a large digital uplift across our entire curriculum and programs. Kelly Matthews, for example, is leading a lot of the conceptual work in a Students as Partners program, in which we are inviting students to actively participate in the development of the curriculum, among other things. We're rethinking our program architecture and our curriculum processes and how we leverage digital technologies to help, among other things again, students visualise what their degrees will look like, to help enable their sort of choice making. The challenges are formidable, folks. we've had a university history and structure in the sector that did very well. It took high school leavers, elite, mostly wealthy, mostly men, and in Australia mostly white. We took them and we were able to use this bridge of our curriculum and propel them towards their future. That has demonstrably not worked now, will not work in the future. As this image clearly infers, the river has moved on. So previous habits of thinking about strategy and curriculum have been useful, but they're now deadly because the river has moved on and we no longer face a predictable world. So a digital learning roadmap has to tackle a number of challenges, and I'd like to share with you a couple today, but they're by no means not the only ones. A good colleague, Jason Lodge, pointed me toward this research recently, a whole body of research, and like many things that Jason shows me, it's absolutely terrifying. It's kind of clear when we do blended learning, when we do flipped classes, for example, well, students learn. They learn better. They learn deeper. But they're not always happy. And this, for me, is quite a scary issue to deal with because our mission is for learning. You know, we're not a restaurant. It's about learning. So when we have instruments in an institution that overly emphasise student happiness, then I'm scared that this shuts down risk. It shuts down academics' appetite to try these new digital practices, to try these new ways of fostering student learning. A dip in student satisfaction, I think, is a very troubling thing for us as teachers. And when I used to teach, it would break my heart if I thought that students were less happy than previously. So we have some brave, I think, choices to make when it comes to how we evaluate our teaching and learning, particularly in this new space where we are obliged to use the very best pedagogic practices supported by the very best technologies. This is a challenge. I'm guessing here, but students are less satisfied because, well, it's also really hard. Self-regulation and the work that we do to foster both the flexibility and the academic literacy skills that they need to prosper, it's quite tricky. We don't rate ourselves very well. So this is a cultural thing. So this is a recent Gartner bit of analysis where CIOs across all these different sectors were asked how well we're performing. What are we doing at the bottom? This is across a number of different countries. Now this is very curious to me. And certainly anecdotally, I think that there's a number of people I've spoken to in my career who are almost resigned to the fact that we're not doing as well as banking. Banking, can you believe it? And there's another little idiosyncrasy for me here too. Universities are training the people who are in these sectors. So I'd like to light a fire under this little factoid and ask the sector, why aren't we at the top? What can we do culturally to reclaim our leadership of digital experience? There's some very smart people at universities and there's some wonderful technologies and talent. We need to do better with not only working with ourselves, but I think we also need to start to look beyond ourselves and start to ask, why are these other sectors performing so well? It's a critical, I think, part of our new future. We need to start thinking about sectors beyond ourselves. You can tell by this diagram that I'm not an economist or an accountant. So if there are any economists or accountants in the room, I'm sorry. I really am sorry. Here's a very simple diagram I put together to try and explain my thinking about the financial structures at universities. And this is an important thing, certainly in my country, to recognise, is that we have earners and we have spenders. So our staff who are teaching, their faculties and schools, they get revenue. and there's a bunch of central or ancillary departments, and they don't really earn revenue, they spend it. And when we look at digital innovations in teaching, quite often what we see is small alliances occur. So a spender and a spender, they get together, or an earner and a spender, or an earner and an earner. But because of the highly distributed nature of power and leadership in the university, there's only a narrow range of things that we produce. We produce exemplars and stories about best practice. We create kits and online resources. We have this enormous fascination with frameworks. You can't throw a rock in the educational pedagogy space and not hit a framework. I've created a few myself. Please don't look at them. And these principles. And all of this is predicated on a culture by which we work on these new practices and these new innovations, and we sort of say, well, do you want to do it? Do you want to have a look at this? I don't think there's anything particularly wrong with that, but it is born of a particular way that money flows throughout the institution and how we think about agency, creativity and power. So it certainly has led me to wonder about the next innovation in teaching and learning innovation. It may well be that it's not a new platform or a new way of integrating or a new system. Maybe it's a financial structure. So if there are any particularly gifted and subversive accountants in the audience today, please come and speak to me after this during lunch. I'd love to hear more about that. Another way of looking at I guess the same issue is found in this diagram here. So policy changes terrify me sometimes, for very good reason, because when we start to mandate a particular practice, if we don't get the wording right, if we don't do this in a systematic way, we can, as Michael put it, throw the baby out with the bathwater. Because there is some fantastic work that happens in the boundaries, in the feral badlands. And we need to foster, we're universities, we need to be active in this space. Similarly, as we all know here, build it and they will come approaches to infrastructure are equally dangerous. So just supplying a new technology doesn't really hit anyone but the people who would innovate anyway, the people who I think of as the worried well. So what I'm trying to do is explain that our area of agency is narrowed. Quite a lot of our work is about improving the broader user experience or the learner experience. It's about supporting these communities and making it normative. It's about putting in rewards. But I am very curious about the other things that we could do, and I'm also very much aware that this does constitute a challenge to the work that we do in the past and in the present and in the future. So what are some of the things that we're doing? Okay, so let me give you a bit of a snapshot of some of the activities. So when a university decides to invest in a large-scale sort of digital uplift, a large-scale improvement or an extension to pedagogic practices, choices have to be made, and some of them are quite operational. For example, where do you start? I've been in 3 institutions where 3 very different decisions were made about where do you start. Do you start, for example, with an organisational unit? Do you start at the faculty level and you do all of the courses and programs within that faculty? Do you do it at the school level? Or do you try to be a little bit more canny and you look at the low-performing courses and units? Or do you look at the high-performing ones and try to make them even better? So there's pros and cons with the choices that you make, and the choice that we made a few years ago at the University of Queensland is to focus on large undergraduate courses, and the thinking there was that this would hit a maximum amount of students, and also because they're first year, those courses are generally first year, these are the student cohorts that are most likely to drop out of university. But of course, it comes with some risks. So these students, after they do that first year course, they'll move on to other courses that perhaps don't have the same digital practices behind them. But it's reckless to try and think that you can do it all. But the challenge here is trying to respond to the most strategic way that you can provide that capability and capacity uplift. How do you do the work? And like everybody else in this room, I've been much taken by the conversations around design thinking and agile approaches to projects. So we've adopted an agile approach to this work. Part of the tactic is funding, again, about money. And the funding that you provide academics to free them up in their workload to partner with us to engage and design and deliver a new experience. Now, one of the tricks with this is that in some ways academics, certainly in Australia, they're like small business owners. You know, they're the ones that are deciding what they're spending their time on with research, with teaching and so forth. And being able to put a neat little sum of money to say, here you go, here's $20,000, find somebody to do your teaching for you for a couple of months. Well, that's great, but they might be the only person skilled in the country or the world to teach it. So quite often, when we're doing this sort of work, it just means more work. But the Agile approach does work. So it's not all doom and gloom. But when you're entering into that work, when you're taking people out of their business as usual, you have to be very mindful that it might not always work exactly to how you've intended. And there are peaks and troughs with the kind of activity. The work that you do in the design and engagement phase is very different from in the development phase, and different resources and different staff are required. So here's another way of looking at the same kind of project. As you can see, all it takes is for a couple of people to be sick for a few weeks and everything's thrown out of whack. But anyway, so we're on track at the University of Queensland to have over 70 courses gone through that process, which means that more than 40,000 students by the end of next year would have had some experience with this new way of experiencing teaching and learning through their courses and so forth. And we're also refining our research and evaluation. We're hoping to undertake a large-scale quantitative ethnography, looking at what the data tells us and matching that to the stories that our students are telling us about their experience. And that'll help refine what we're doing as we go in. So it seems on certain metrics that this particular project's working quite well. It's not on this slide, but achievement, engagement, and GPA have all improved. All right. So now I'd like to provide a little bit of an overview of the things that I just think work. Is there evidence behind them? Well, there is, but this is also just a personal reflection of some of the tactics and ways of thinking that I think have been effective for somebody who's been working in this space for over 20 years. These are the lights on the hill that allow brave new worlds to be identified and illuminate those obstacles, those rocks that can get you into trouble. Erica McWilliams' work on unlearning pedagogy, I still think, is a thrilling bit of work. Every time a new digital technology comes along, it enhances and destroys our competencies and practices. And it's a clear opportunity to deeply critique some of our deadly habits. Number 2 really stands out for me in this new world. The teachers should know more than their students. I'm not sure how many academics I know these days who could confidently say that they know more across the board than their students. We also have a number of pedagogic practices that are a lot easy to implement and conceive nowadays because of these new technologies that help us really challenge other habits of teaching. Curriculum must be set in advance. Teachers assess, students are assessed. Number 7 can be perhaps the most challenging. Our disciplines can save the world. And I think that last presentation was quite an interesting one and spoke to having a clear set of perspectives about what our universities can do and what they can't do. Universities aren't the only institutional manner in which people learn. And we have to be bold and courageous enough to realise that. I came across this particular bit of work maybe 15 years ago, and I found it to be a very compelling way to start a conversation with with an academic, with a head of school and with a dean, particularly when it comes to that very almost scary point when you're moving away from face-to-face teaching into a much more rich digital experience. The notion of excursions, so the notion of a teacher identity, not as a didact, but somebody who takes students like a tour guide through unfamiliar, discursive and conceptual terrain, for me is a very important design metaphor, because it helps inform what happens in the classroom and what we put and what we support in online environments. It helps distinguish between those moments when students are preparing for their trip, when they're in the excursion, and when they finish the excursion and they're thinking about what they've seen, and they're talking about what they've done, and they're trying to make sense of it all. And this, I think, has been, for me, in my practice, a very useful way to inform the choice making between very simple things: what you put on a website, how you standardise and how you architect a particular structure. What kinds of stories and videos and case studies do you want to compose, and where do they fit within that kind of metaphor? So a digital learning strategy needs to factor in the time for those sorts of conceptual, navel-gazing kind of conversations. I love metaphors. There's not just one way to have an online experience that sits alongside or replaces a face-to-face one. I think Twig's work is still very compelling for me, and the metaphors that she put forward in a general sense, that I think every institution can have their own version of, I think make a lot of sense. Are you replacing something that used to happen in a face-to-face environment? Are you supplementing? Are you producing a buffet approach, a linked workshop approach? And this is where the metaphors that I think exist in our digital lives already are very useful. And I think about how we fly these days. Almost every airline has its own app, and you consult that app before you go. You use it when you're on the plane and when you, but it's not flying, you know. There's a different way to think about that experience. I love Marvel. I love some of the movies that Marvel has put out, and I think that they've done a really wonderful job in their storytelling, using cameos and crossovers and flash forwards and flashbacks. I find that to be a useful metaphor when you're thinking about a blended learning experience as well. Because what happens online, the character that you introduce online at a different part of the timetable or the semester, there's an opportunity to bring them into the face-to-face environment, to bring them into the assessment. And so how you weave a story through these different modalities, I think, is a really important creative act. Of course, you don't have to do it like that. And there's a lot to be said from the lessons from open world gaming, where there's nothing at the end, where we can create these situation engines that completely sit alongside their experience in face-to-face classrooms. There is no end point. There are a suite of opportunities to solve problems, to connect with others. And the experiences in that kind of world are emergent and may or may not completely coalesce with what's happening in the face-to-face environment. There's other metaphors, of course, and using metaphors and rich pictures and that kind of thing is a very important way to tell that story about what our digital learning direction could look like. Brad Haseman from Cadenza has some interesting and very subversive, I think, thoughts about the arts practice and how that can enrich learning design. And one particular trope that I'd like to think about a bit more deeply is the deep objection to cognitive load theory. I'm sure a lot of people in this room have come across cognitive load theory, and to be unkind, cognitive load theory tells us to strip back the noise, to try and make sure that we present interfaces and experiences that are pure signal. The artistic redundancy effect argues the opposite. We need to introduce colour and contradiction and complexity, because that's where the cognition happens. That's how we provide students with a rich experience to deeply think, to navigate, and to find out what is true for them. in particular teaching and learning. And I'd really encourage anyone who's interested to do a bit of a Google search on that kind of work, because I think, I do think it's quite subversive, which is great. Of course, you can think about digital learning experiences and strategy in terms of the many excellent frameworks and theories that I am personally quite overwhelmed by, but some really stand out. I still like Diana Laurelard's work on design science, this notion of design patterns or heuristics, the idea that you can articulate, and if you look at any kind of case study in the literature, it's reasonably, I think, simple to distill from those stories a design pattern. How do the technologies, the activities, the resources, the assessment, the context allow us to create a blueprint that could be applied productively to other places? I think for me that's a very useful way to think about our virtual learning environments and the things that we do to support the use of these environments, which is key. And recently, the Higher Education Learning Framework, I think, is a very sophisticated set of principles as well. And one of the reasons that I like it is that it was, as I understand it, it was developed by interviewing some of the best, most researched and sort of most highly celebrated pedagogues around the world. And it focuses on discipline and context. It focuses on emotions and learning and interactivity. And I think, unlike some other frameworks, it embraces some of the complexity and some of the colour and some of the mystery around teaching and learning. And finally, I'd like to share a couple of the things that I'm really looking forward to. So I said at the start that, in fact, it's not about the technology, it's about the people. I kind of lied. It's also about the technology. And there's some fantastic things, I think, on the horizon. Like everybody, I'm very, very interested with machine learning, artificial intelligence, deep learning, natural language processing. I think there's some amazing ways that we can leverage this sort of thinking to supplement how we do our work, how we think about assessment, how we can be more powerful in our work. I don't think that these technologies are going to replace our teaching. I think they might replace some of our processes, which would be great. But I'm even more excited about some other stuff. Recently I've come across the low-code, no-code movement. Has anybody come across that? Can I get a quick show of hands? It's quite new for me. All right. So this is a movement. It's Application Platform as a Service, or APAS, and it's very new, and it's a way to allow people who do not know how to code or program create their own software. I've had a bit of a play with it myself, and I can very easily imagine this increasing over the next 4 or 5 years, getting us to a point where it's completely realistic that an individual academic would want to create their own bit of bespoke software. Guess what? That they want to link into the virtual learning environment. I think that's something that we are hurtling toward. So what I'm talking about here is less standardization. I'm talking about more complexity and that challenge of how we balance novelty and consistency will only increase. I'm very excited about agent-based simulations. There's something about that kind of work, particularly when we provide environments for students to set up their own rules and their own ways of thinking and their own ways of running these kind of sims. I think that's an enormously satisfying piece of work, and its reach can extend beyond IT, beyond agriculture, into the humanities, into the creative industries and elsewhere. I think our assessment practices are going to be reimagined. I think there's some baseline work that we're doing with digitisation, but we do have an opportunity to rethink what assessment looks like and can be conceived. I had an experience recently where I participated in a long-form exam. I had an exam for 5 days. And this sort of exam, this digital exam, meant that I had to be ready at the drop of a hat to drop what I was doing and to attend to the question and the change in scenario. I loved it. Everybody around me didn't love it, but I loved it. And of course, there's a range of things like digital twins and work in virtual labs and things that we have not even heard of before. I'm very much looking forward to that relationship between the new pedagogic practices and the technology enablers that we haven't even, I think, scratched the surface of yet. So I'm going to leave you with a paradox I came across recently, the Icarus paradox. And this goes to my first point about reimagining what strategy looks like in higher education. Quite simply, the Icarus paradox is the idea that the things that made us successful in the past are exactly the same things that will ensure that we fail in the future. This is a warning. And the danger here is that our frameworks become blinders, our processes become routines, our relationships become shackles, and our values become dogmas. And it is a cliche, but in this fast-moving world, volatile world, where these needs and opportunities are gathering apace, then any strategy that we put forward, we also need to be brave enough to immediately put aside if it's not working. So, thank you all for your time. It was a great privilege to be invited to come here and share my thoughts on this. And so a very sincere thank you to Blackboard for that invitation. Thank you very much.